see it reported there in the last couple of days that the two women, the so-called Dubai two ladies who went to Dubai for allegedly, or it's reported, breast enhancement surgery, didn't go ahead, but when they came back then they refused to go into the hotel quarantine, the enforced quarantine situation for 12 days when they came back. So they were ultimately arrested and brought before the district court and were charged with offences in relation to either the Health Act or the Health Amendment Act of 2021, which brought in the enforced quarantine regime to deal with the whole COVID-19 pandemic situation. The ladies then, the women, were granted bail in the district court, but the recognizance was fixed at a price, at a level that they couldn't afford, and they spent a night then in the women's prison in Mountjoy, Docus Women's Centre, and their legal team then went to the High Court, I think last Saturday, Easter Saturday, and the High Court ordered their release on foot of the application brought by the legal team, but they were only released back into the quarantine regime at designated hotel. So they then decided that they were going to challenge the constitutionality of the regime, of the whole regime, which was brought in, which basically brings about an enforced quarantine period for people travelling into the country. And that quarantine period is not just at home or anywhere else, it's at a designated hotel. So they are going to challenge that. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. Ironically, the ladies in question will be out of quarantine. They'll have completed the 12 days of quarantine period by the time the High Court on the 20th of April, it is said, will be able to give them a date for the hearing of the action. They will be bringing an application to challenge the constitutionality of the quarantine system, the quarantine arrangement and regulations and so on. Now, it's thought that they have a very high hurdle to clear, that they are unlikely to succeed. However, there is some basis for the challenge, and the grounds that they will be challenging, it's speculated, will include that the quarantine legislation has created an absolute liability offence for which there is no defence, that it is whether it's proportionate to detain a person in quarantine if they've taken a number of COVID tests which have proved to be negative. And apparently these women did take 2 or 3 tests either before or during this whole debacle, and all of the tests proved to be negative. Another ground as to why the challenge will go ahead would be that the appeal against a mandatory quarantined person can only proceed after going to a hotel. And the fourth ground, it's speculated, will be that the status of the public official who decides whether a person can leave a hotel quarantine situation or not, the status of that person is going to be very controversial, to put it mildly, because obviously the significance of deciding against allowing a person to be released is a decision that's normally made by perhaps a court or on Garda Síochána under a specific act or whatever. Whereas here we're looking at a public official who's going to decide whether a person stays in the hotel under quarantine or not. So they are the 4 grounds that it's speculated will be used to try to overturn the legislation, or at least get a finding that the quarantine legislation is unconstitutional. Now, there is a fair degree of judicial deference towards the Oireachtas in terms of lawmaking and so on, because of the doctrine of separation of powers, and for that reason it is thought that the substantive issue, the substantive regime that's brought in to deal with COVID-19 and so on may not be overturned, or it would be very, very difficult. However, in this specific case, or perhaps with regard to the specific quarantine regulations or arrangements, there may be prospects for success there on procedural grounds perhaps. But given the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, given the variations and the mutations and so forth that are popping up, and given the what the state will claim is the public interest, given the state's evidence, reliance on medical evidence and data and so on, it will be a big ask, but it will be interesting, and I hope, for the sake of the legal position, I hope that the thing does go ahead, even though, as I say, by the time that a date will be given for the hearing of this challenge, the two ladies will have spent the 12 days in quarantine and they'll be finished with it. Anyway, I hope you find this video useful. If you do, I'd appreciate it if you give it the thumbs up down below. Thanks a lot.